Welcome everyone to week 3. Today I'm going to be talking about chapter 2 of your book. We will likely break up the talk into 2 parts. If you want to follow along with me on your slide presentation, um, you'll see the slide presentation as chapter 2, Ethical Theories, Religion and Reason. And those will be the ones that we're talking about today. More interestingly, if you look at the next slide, Moral Theories on Ethics Overview, what you're going to see on that slide is an overview of everything that we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks. And that by that I mean all the ideas that we're going to be talking about as influential to ethical decision making. So we're going to be covering a variety of different thinkers, and because of the time limitations that we have together in this course, we're not going to be able to talk about each of the philosophers that you see um, at, at length. Rather, we're going to take their ideas and extrapolate those ideas and make the connection between how they can impact sound ethical choices. So I am going to talk about the history of these philosophers and give you a sort of highlight history of each of them. And what you read about in your second chapter of the book is also going to assist in your understanding um, of the different ideas, or what we sometimes call doctrines, um, sets of ideas that come from philosophical thinkers over centuries. Really, the starting point for us in this course has been personal ethics, or looking towards oneself, in chapter 1, and now that we're moving to chapter 2, we're going to be talking about basically religious impacts on ethical decision making, as well as the earliest thinkers in Western civilized thought, which are, of course, and we'll talk about this later, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all of which have made massive contributions to the fields of ethics, or to the field of ethics and axiology over throughout the years. So we start with the ancient thinkers, and then next week we move into the modern theories of ethics. And then in chapter 4, we're talking about basically what we call postmodern ethical doctrines that we can learn from. So we're seeking again the balance between all of these as they might impact our decision making in the way of ethics. So to start off, I want to point you to the chapter objectives that you'll see on page 29 of your textbook. It says there in the left-hand column, by the end of this chapter, the student should be able to appreciate the historical origins of ethical philosophy, compare and evaluate various models of ethical reasoning, recognize the basis of moral argument, understand the Socratic method of questioning, which is a key piece of what's talked about in this chapter, discuss divine command theory and virtue ethics, and then lastly, apply divine command theory and virtue ethics to current ethical issues. So those are the objectives. The very first part of explaining the work of these 3 philosophers that I've mentioned, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In philosophy, we recognize these philosophers as the tripartite of Western thought. That is to say that for a lot of scholars and academics today, when we look back at these particular thinkers, we recognize them as being massively influential to how we think, and they've provided work for us that we still seek to understand, and that we still try to implement or practice in our case. So another sort of important point is we're going to cover the historical origins, but only to a certain degree, since it's not a history course. What we want to do is capitalize and focus on those ideas and what those ideas mean and how we might apply them. So in order to be able to do that, we do have to get into the history again. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all share a relationship with each other that we say is a student-teacher relationship, just as a lead-off to this talk. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. And we look at, when we look back at their works, we generally say, okay, Socrates was a character in Greece who really never wrote anything down. There is no books by Socrates. All of what we have comes from Plato about Socrates or about the life that Socrates led. So it's sometimes confusing to understand where a particular idea is coming from with these two philosophers. So we say Socrates, Plato are usually connected, usually synonymous in what kinds of ideas they're presenting. And then, of course, there is Aristotle, who is to be differentiated or has a different set of ideas, a different doctrine that we apply to ethics. So for our purpose here, we'll say Socrates and Plato mostly agree on the ideas that on their ideas, and Aristotle takes issue with some of these ideas, and as a result of this sort of back and forth, we get a nice balance between different ways to think about ethics, ethical theory, and ultimately ethical practice. So the quote that I want to read to you comes from the very first page of the chapter, and it says, in order to make good decisions we can live with, we must first of all know ourselves, which we learned about in chapter 1, and know what kind of person we want to be, and be honest with ourselves about that. Second, we need to decide what ethical decisions we make, what the ethical decision we make will be based on. And when we think about these ideas that we're talking about now, it makes perfectly legitimate sense to say that some of the ways that we act are going to be based on what we're learning about here in this chapter, in the coming chapters, that we could actually think or act in a particular way, ethical, in dealing with an ethical situation or an ethical dilemma, and that we can thank these ideas for having survived so long to be able to still apply them. So this is where an understanding of the various ethical theories comes in, and that's right off your first page. So the first chapter here, as we say, is what we call the not the first chapter, but this chapter 2 is the historical chapter. It's the historical chapter because it starts right from the beginning. We know that when people first formulated the what to do in particular scenarios, or the difference between right and wrong, and so forth, they relied upon religion. And we're not talking here about one religion. We could even be talking about what came before religion, mythology, and how at one point in our human history there was only the presence of mythological gods, and people would their behavior would be steered and directed by what the gods told them to do. And then that sort of moved in out of mythology, what we call the supernatural explanations for the universe and the world, into what we call the religion, or mythology as turning its head and sort of becoming religion, or different groups of religions over time. And the most popular of these religions were probably Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as a sort of another triad of different influences that people relied upon to make ethical choices. So that's our starting point. We start with what's called divine command theory in this chapter. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what divine command theory actually is, and how we define it, and how we can apply it, or we can talk about, have dialogue about how people use these kinds of theories, or what they read about in the Bible, let's say, as an example, to make decisions about what to do in their lives. And a lot of times these are ethical choices, and sometimes they aren't. But how do we define divine command theory, or DCT as it's sometimes referred to? We say, okay, these are the basic premises, the basic precepts, principles of divine command theory. God decides what is good. So a thing is good because God says so. Good is therefore dependent upon God. Our understanding of the good is dependent upon God. Again, we have to remind ourselves this isn't any one God, but notice God with a big G is not the same thing as gods as it was, in mythological times. We have to also put this into context, and when we think about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and we're going to talk about later, the time that they lived in was a time of mythological gods. But there are still to this day a lot of connections between the Christianity, Islam, Judaism, with the theories that came from Plato and Aristotle. And when we talk about how to define the good, that's an interpretation that comes as a result of any given religious doctrine. So we could have conflict and disagreement about that. What is the good, and what is good in terms of a balanced interpretation. The next point that I include on that slide is God defines what is good. In other words, God shows humans what is inherently good, how to act. And so we move to the next slide. Divine command theory, when we think about it in the context of ethics, the ethics are transferred to humans by either direct command, meaning reading through, interpreting what is said in a religious doctrine, like, for example, the Bible, and following it and committing to it. So what does this involve? And I've said it on the slide. It usually requires unquestioning obedience. That for the longest time in the period of sort of religious history, we could say that people followed God's law, or people followed the Ten Commandments, as you see here, and never questioned those commandments. Nowadays, it seems to have moved into or advanced in a few different ways, and one of which is, it's okay to ask questions if we are trying to get answers, and if we're trying to figure out the best potential behavior to engage in, or what the difference is between not right and wrong necessarily, but the idea that there might be more than one right choice to make. So that's important. So the ethics are transferred to humans by direct command or indirect message. And here we say sometimes people take what's in a religious doctrine and they interpret it in the wrong way, or they misinterpret something, or the interpretation that they have doesn't agree with others, and this causes conflict. Although, when there is agreement, it could influence people, of course, in a good way. A lot of what we see in the Bible or the Quran is good in teaching people how to lead a good life. I always say that religion is exactly that. Those religious doctrines, like the Bible and the Quran, are essentially recipe books for the good life, and that we should be directing our attention to what we can learn from the behavior that is recommended under each one of those religious affiliations that we see. Most religions, to my knowledge, will never instruct a human to kill another human or harm another human. So if we read through a passage in a religious doctrine that tells us otherwise, then we we should be asking questions, right? Or we should be turning to ourselves and questioning our own interpretation and our understanding. If you move to the next slide, you see applying divine command theory. And this, of course, the oldest origin of ethical theory is religion. And divine command theory is really the place where everything started. A lot of scholars still agree that out of religion came ethics, or out of religious thought and religious ideals came the practice or study of ethics. We look to the next slide, applying divine command theory in DCT. One of the 10 commandments is honor your father and your mother. One way I would apply this to my daily life is by respecting their house rules when I'm at home. When I think about that, that's a rule that I was made to follow, right? Not necessarily because of religion necessarily, but because this was a sort of moral principle that my parents instilled in me, that as a sign of respect, you should be honoring your mother and father by following the rules, which is also something that we would read about in the Bible. So in that way, even if my behavior wasn't impacted by religion, we have religion to say, okay, but divine command theory also tells us this. So we could also give, as I say on the slide, give some examples of other ways you could apply that religious principle to your life. How other people respect you. What do you understand respect to mean or involve? What level of respect do you show? And so all of these sort of notions are sort of planted by the divine command theory, or began as a result of it. So consider a religious command or parable that you're familiar with. Of course, if you're not religious, if you're non-religious, or if you're, the proper way to say it would probably be agnostic or atheist. Agnostic is, I'm not sure, I'm on the fence about things, and atheist is, I've committed to the belief in no God. And then a theist would be someone that believes in God. So depending here, if you are a theist, if you do have a religious affiliation, you could consider a religious command or parable that you're familiar with, and then think about how that command or that principle might work once you enter the marketplace, or once you go into your career. How is that going to influence your behavior in the workplace? Typically, we know, and you'll see this on your reflection this week, that we know that religion finds its way into the workplace via different people bringing it in and talking about how they handle situations in reference to, even if they're not talking about it, in reference to something that they might be a product of their religious values. So when we're talking about the application of divine command theory, it's, yes, not a popular theory anymore in terms of ethics, but it is the historical sort of starting point. And we have to acknowledge that some people are going to be able to take the rules and principles that they've learned about and find application for them in places like the marketplace, your career. We could also apply it to our home environment. How would you apply it to your the relationships in your life, right? And so, as we do with most of these theories, the next slide that you see is entitled Proponents and Critics' View of Divine Command Theory. Here it's like looking at both sides, looking at people that would support this theory, that would be a proponent, and then people that don't necessarily support this particular theory as critics. So I asked the question, what are some arguments that someone who believed in divine command theory would give to support this ethical framework? And I've sort of alluded to it through my examples thus far, that basically, if people lead a religious life, as an example, and they've read through different passages in the Bible, and they're familiar with the Bible or another religious doctrine, and they take what they see and interpret it the right way, and it influences their behavior in a good way, then that's a positive. That's definitely a positive. There is a philosopher, modern philosopher by the name of William James, who has an idea about this, and he says that if you are religious and religion helps you navigate through life better than without it, then keep doing what you're doing, basically, is his idea. Don't change something that isn't broken, right? That it's probably good for people that are religious to continue in their practices, their faith practices, if it's influencing their behavior, and here we're talking about ethical behavior, of course, as well, in a good way, then they continue doing that. But on the other side of this, we can also say, what are some of the arguments that someone who did not agree with divine command would make to criticize this ethical framework? And here I would say, well, divine command theory, DCT, is an archaic or a primitive theory. It's really, really old. And the fabric of current citizenry, or the way that people are today, is such that religion either has a place or it doesn't have a place in their life. And again, I'll refer to the reflection that you are to complete for this week, having to do with religion. When religion finds its way into the workplace, it can sometimes present us with problems and conflict, and then we have to think about how to deal with it appropriately, but also as global citizens and as ethical practitioners. So that's something for you to think about. But that's our first referenced moral theory in this class, and then we call it divine command theory. If you move to the next slide, you're going to see the title, The Healthy Soul, Socrates and Plato. And here I've grouped them together because, again, Socrates is the person that influences Plato's writing. And so Plato often writes about Socrates' life and the conversation that he had with people in Athens, Greece, and the different scenarios that he was a part of. And then we take what we read and we learn from those activities in the way that Socrates acted, in the way that he thought, and so forth. So this healthy soul argument that we're going to be learning about today comes from a book called The Republic, which Plato wrote. And in the book, what he does through a variety of different chapters is he tries to establish what justice is and what we mean by justice in that book, The Republic. And the justice that he's referring to is, of course, justice within a community. How can we build the best society or the ideal society? And for him, it was the ideal city. How can we build the ideal city and have a community be happy? And you'll see that all of these three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, had a particular concern for defining what it meant to be happy, and the fact that we aim as humans to be happy. That's our goal. All three of them address this, particularly Plato and Aristotle in their writing. But the healthy soul argument comes from the Republic, and probably is connected with the dialogues of Plato as well, the different famous passages outside of the Republic that we call the dialogues. So what happens with this argument is Plato puts together a sort of thought process where he believed that everybody had a soul, as did Plato, as did Aristotle, as did Socrates. All of them believed in the soul. In fact, the Greeks believed in the notion of soul, and they took it very seriously, to the extent that everything that they did in their lives was in preparation for the afterlife, or where the soul would go after they were no longer alive in this reality. So the healthy soul comes as a product of the Republic, and what it tells us is that, and what Plato tells us is that everyone has a soul, but everyone has three parts to their soul, and that when all these parts work together, when they are able to achieve balance, that we can be better people, that we could, obviously for our purpose here, we can learn from that system how to make better choices and be more ethical in our relationships with others. So we say, what are the parts of the soul? And I've listed them there. There is what we call the rational element, or rationality. And this is the part of the soul that Plato thought that reason is enacted, where reason resides in the soul, is under the rational element of the soul. We all have the ability to be rational. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work to think about things and reason through them, but we all have that ability, Plato thought. Next, he talks about, or I should mention there, part of this, first element, the rational element, is that we have the ability to reflect, as we're learning already. And I've said repeatedly in the first set of video lectures on this course that reflection is a key piece. Both reflection and reason are key pieces of our rationality, which is, again, one part of our soul. Next, he says that we also have an irrational part of our soul, or the appetite. It's sometimes called the appetitive part of our soul. And the appetite is what guides our behavior a lot of the times. If we're hungry, we eat. If we're thirsty, we drink. If we desire sex, then these are all natural desires. We have both natural and unnatural desires as humans. You might say self-interest is a irrational appetite, or you could say, but it's also a natural appetite that we all possess. So we have to strike a balance between the things that we need and the things that we want here. That's what the cure is for the appetitive part of our soul, according to Plato, that we are looking to differentiate and understand for ourselves that we can't have everything, and that we should seek to achieve the things that we need always more than the things that we want. Some of us are going to have the ability to achieve both of those things. Ideally, I hope everyone has that opportunity, but we know the reality tells us otherwise. So then we have to work at that part of the soul, just like we have to work at the rational part of our souls to be able to reason, to reflect. We do the same thing with the irrational appetite. We have to be able to decide, the things that we need, from the things that we don't necessarily need, or prioritize the things that matter, as you saw in that video from last week, prioritizing things that matter in our lives, and the example of the golf balls and the professor. And so something to think about. And the last part of the soul here is what we call the spirited element. And this is our emotions. And it probably is worth noting that a lot of our behaviors and a lot of the ways that we act when we deal with different problems and dilemmas in our life is fueled by or is driven by our emotions. And so Plato acknowledges that we have an emotional side to us, and we have an emotional part of our soul. Perhaps we could say that the emotional part of the soul is maybe where love resides, right? So again, we have these three parts of the soul, and what are we working towards? We're working towards achieving a balance. I'm going to go into your textbook now and point you to page, we'll say page 36 of your textbook. There's some important pieces here that we can discuss, and that I would encourage that you also go through and read. at the top it says, or sort of halfway down the page 36, Socrates was the first philosopher to be interested in examining human nature rather than trying to determine the nature of the universe, which is what the pre-Socratics, or the people before him, tried to discover, philosophers included. He was also the first to claim that ethical behavior could be determined through reason rather than faith. So, of the three elements that we've just looked at, reason is the most important. Our ability to use reason as our guide, even when we're making ethical decisions, is sometimes difficult. But that would be his recommendation for us. Also, I want to point to, if we go to page 38, halfway down the page, a balanced soul is one in which the physical appetites and emotions are ruled by reason. There, we're making it very clear that the physical appetites and our emotions are going to be ruled by reason. Yes, we are achieving a balance of our soul, but we know that if we had to name the nucleus, or the centerpiece of the soul, we would say that's reason, particularly maybe even wisdom, as you'll read about in your chapter. Wisdom is the highest form of human knowledge. And so we say that's probably the type of reasoning that he wanted us to aim towards. Learning from our mistakes is wisdom. It's a key piece of understanding what wisdom is all about. So again, that's the idea that we're looking at here. The healthy soul is a way of understanding the way people operate. And if it's true that we have souls, and we don't really even have to agree with the idea or notion of soul, we could say this is the mind. This is what human nature is, that we have these three parts that are constantly and sometimes working against each other, right? At the same time, we want to improve ourselves. So we say, well, reason has to be our guide. And when I make a choice, when it's an ethical choice, if my emotions are always guiding me, then that's problematic, and it's going to have consequences for me in my everyday life. Here I would say, does that mean that that Plato would suggest that no decisions that we make can involve the emotions? And to that I would say no. They're going to involve the emotions, but we need to be able to understand that reason has more value than emotions in the way of making good choices. So on the next slide, what is happiness? This is important also because it's the aim, or it's the target of having a balanced soul. If we can achieve the balance, then Plato thought, Socrates and Plato, that we can actually be happy. What is happiness then? To define it, happiness is defined as inner peace or contentment. Happiness in a community is something different, but happiness here starts with self. So Plato believed that happiness starts at the individual level and then mirrors into a community, or carries into a community. And he says in his work that the soul, or the city, the community, the city magnifies the soul. And there he was talking about the balanced soul. So what is happiness then? Happiness on the individual level. It's the lack of inner turmoil that results when the three elements of the soul are in harmony, when they work together. When I'm able to tell myself that I make decisions in my life based on reason, based on emotions, and based on appetite. But if I had to pick a guide, and if I want to commit to a guide, or the primary navigation tool for who I am, then I want to say that that's reason. That's what's going to take me to happiness. Happiness can only occur in a person with a healthy soul. Here we say, again, to follow up, when a healthy soul is in balance, and this is the next slide, the healthy soul argument. When a soul is in balance, the reason is in control of the appetites and the emotions. When a soul is unbalanced, the appetites or the emotions are in control. And here I'm thinking, you can probably imagine, even people that are in your circle or your bubble, as we call it today, people that are completely controlled by their appetites, that they only seek their appetites. And the other two parts of their soul or their mind, which we sometimes use synonymously today, soul, mind, are pretty much understood synonymously. When someone is controlled by their appetites or their emotions, they're going to run the risk of getting into more trouble, especially when we think about it through an ethical lens. And to use an analogy I said on that slide as well, when a person is ill, he or she does not have much control over what he says and does, or what he is capable of doing as when he is healthy. And here I'm reminded of when you're admitted to a hospital and you have a surgery and then you're released, so let's say the next day or two. The hospital always pays very careful attention to guiding you safely out of the hospital. And they always, well, I shouldn't say always because we don't know this for sure, but most of the time, if you were under an anesthetic of any kind, or if your consciousness was altered in any way when you were in the hospital as a patient, then they will tell you not to make any important decisions in your life. And why is that? Why do healthcare teams and hospitals, medical practitioners advise patients in this way? Because they are familiar and they understand that people that have had an anesthetic or a drug that has altered their way of thinking are not going to be in the best position. They're not going to be entirely healthy enough to make a decision that is an important decision. So I guess we could say we don't want to go out and buy a house or buy a car or make an important ethical decision if we're just released from the hospital after having an anesthetic. And that's an example that we can connect with this. That what he's not talking about the health of your physical health necessarily as much as he's talking about the health of your own being in the way that you make decisions and the way that you make choices, right and or wrong. When a person's soul, if we move to the next slide, when a person's soul is ill or out of balance, she does not have rational control over her decisions and behavior. We sometimes step off and make a bad choice. And that won't ever end completely in this life for us as ethical agents. We're always going to make mistakes, and we're always going to make bad choices and wrong choices. And the key is here to learn from those choices. To learn that at that particular point when we made the choice, that we might have relied upon emotion more than reason, or that we might have relied upon, more of an appetite that we had to be selfish when we made that decision, that we probably should have thought through a little bit more. Again, that's learning from it, and that's also sort of seeking balance in the soul, according to Plato. Every time a person lets his appetites or emotions overcome his reason, his soul becomes a little bit more unhealthy. And it becomes harder to regain control or to become healthy again. So when we say, if a person is continually making decisions as a result of the emotional part of their soul, or continually making decisions, settles into a habit of making decisions only based on their own appetite, then what Plato is telling us, or has told us, is that we're damaging the soul. And here I might use an example like Bernie Madoff, or anybody that has been in a situation where you make one bad choice and another bad choice, and after a while it's just so many bad choices that you settle into a habit and you're no longer able to recognize your own moral sort of corruption and the fact that your soul or your being has been corrupted in some way. We move to the next slide, applying the healthy soul theory, which is likely where we'll leave off for today in the video lecture. We'll finish off with Plato and then come back and talk about Aristotle in the next part. So applying the healthy soul, here's a couple of examples to think about. If I let my emotions control my reason, I might react with anger in a situation instead of responding more reasonably. This could harm a relationship that is important to me or in some other way harm me. The other example, if I let my appetites control my reason, I might eat or drink substances that are harmful, even fatal. I might not notice when I'm overindulging in a substance that is okay in moderation, but harmful in excess. So here, the carryover, or the way that we think about this on the practical level in application to what we're trying to pull away from the balanced soul idea in Plato. How would you apply this theory to your behavior at work? Well, we start by saying, how many decisions did I make on the job today that were the result of my own sort of appetitive need for something, or my own appetitive want for something? Did I make this decision based on self-interest, or was I looking out for the interest of others when I made that decision? How else might I apply it? Well, when people are confronted with a lot of different things at once in the workplace, and they have a meltdown, and we think about that, what happens in the workplace when there is some kind of a meltdown, an employee has too many things to do and responds to a scenario or a dilemma with emotions that they don't really mean to sort of put on display, but they do, right? We might say, well, that person is being controlled by their emotion. They're reacting with anger. Maybe they haven't had time to think about whatever there's the variables of the situation that they're involved with. We could also carry this beyond the workplace. We think about many different examples in application to the workplace. How do you use reason? Right? How do you use that part of your soul to make good decisions for your employer or for your management team, right? How would you apply this theory to your behavior at home? Give an example. How might you, well, think about the relationships that you have with other people that you live with or that are part of your home environment. For me, it's how do I teach my children the right way? And when I make decisions when I react with emotions, how does that impact my moral character? How does that, am I setting a good example for my son or my daughter if I do X or if I choose Y? How would you apply this theory to your important relationships? Again, I sort of extrapolated on that in that previous example. But important relationships beyond your family, let's say, your friends and your colleagues, maybe even so the people you work with. As is the case, and then we've already discussed this, there are proponents and critics of the healthy soul theory. People that support Plato, the proponents of Plato's work, because I've asked you that on the slide, what are some of the arguments that someone who believed in this theory would give to support this ethical framework? That it makes sense to try to seek a balanced soul. And here, we're not going to be talking about this idea of the healthy soul at the boardroom table, in our organization 5 years from now. But we might be talking about how the individuals that we hire or the individuals that work in a particular company, how they have the ability or inability to use reason the way that we would like them to as a company, or the way that some employees react with emotions too much. Right? How are we going to strike a balance? When we talk about that in application to the marketplace, it starts to make a little bit of sense that even an idea this sort of old and ancient, coming from the work of Plato's Republic, can actually help us or guide our behavior in ethical ways here in modern times. So, what are some arguments that someone who did not agree with this theory would make to criticize this ethical framework? The first one I would say to you, and of course, as you're reading through, you might be thinking, I don't necessarily agree with Plato's healthy soul. Here's a problem I have, and that's perfectly okay. You're probably going to still be able to take a part of his theory and a part of his thinking and find a connection with it, or find value in it, and using it when you're making choices, ethical choices. But in terms of people that would disagree with or criticize this ethical framework, not everyone believes that morality or the practice of ethics should be focused on the individual. And that's one of the things that Plato does. He says that the becoming an ethical practitioner basically starts with self. Socrates agrees. But others will tell us that it doesn't start with self, it starts with community. It starts with the relationships we have with others. And we're going to learn about this more when we talk about Carol Gilligan again in the Ethics of Care. So there's a variety of different ways to critique this theory. You as a sort of learner, myself as a learner, what we want to be able to do is say there's pros and cons to this theory. Here's a couple that I can think of. And maybe we choose that, or maybe we discovered that this is something that we can actually work towards improving in our own lives. And so how would we go about sort of repairing or fixing our souls if we find that we make too many bad choices as a result of emotions or appetite? And I would suggest to you, self-reflection is your key that opens the door. And we can thank Plato and Aristotle, or Plato and Socrates, for sort of enlightening us in that way. That morality starts with self, and beyond religion, there is this notion of the soul that Plato gives us, that we try to achieve harmony and balance as we are making ethical choices. And not just the ones that we make for ourselves, but the ones that we make with each other, right? Especially when we talk about working with other employees, or as a team, or as a community. To make the best decisions is to take stock in the idea that self-reflection is a necessity, but balance is also a necessity, seeking balance. I want my rational and my spirited and my rational, my emotional, and my appetite to all be sort of balanced, and understand myself in that way. And that is likely going to set me up to make better ethical choices. All right. So I'll see you in the second video lecture on the follow-up to this, which will focus on the work of Aristotle. See you then.